My young friends, I'm really glad to be able to talk to you a little bit about one of my experiences in the former Soviet Union. For many years, I had the privilege of holding evangelistic meetings in Poland, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and of course in Russia. And during those years, I met a number of our Adventist leaders who inspired me greatly. These Adventist leaders leave a great legacy of their faith. They leave behind a trail of commitment, dedication, faith to the Adventist message, the Adventist Church. One of my great heroes of faith was Elder Mikhail Kulakov. I got to know him quite closely in the early 1990s. I'll never forget, we were having our evangelistic meetings in the Kremlin auditorium. 12,000 people were coming every night. And Elder Kulakov stood on the stage with me, and he was just weeping and crying, and I asked him why. And he said, because I never thought in my wildest dreams that I could have anybody ever preach in the Kremlin. I remember when I was in the Ukraine preaching at the Communist Center there, what had formerly been a Communist Party center, government official center, that his son, Peter Kulakov, was translating for me, and the message went up via satellite, but it actually came down in the prison. We had put a satellite dish in a prison. It came down in the prison where Elder Kulakov was imprisoned for many years previously. And he had prayed in that prison that God would bless his life and expand the message of God to the prison. And it was quite remarkable that we had got permission to put a satellite dish up in that prison. But I want to tell you one story about Elder Kulakov. He was in prison 5 years for his faith. When I talked to him about it, he smiled and he said, well, Mark, that was the graduate school that I went to. And I said, what do you mean? He said, I met many rabbis in prison and they taught me Hebrew. And it was that knowledge that I used to translate the Russian Bible from the original languages, translate the Hebrew into the Russian Bible, modern Russian. They had just had a very old translation that wasn't very accurate. But he was in prison for 5 years. At the end of the 5 years, he was still in his 20s. He was sent to life exile. Now, in life exile, he was sent from the European portion of Russia to the Asiatic portion over by Kamchatka, by the Japan Sea. And he was dropped in a village with, of course, very few young people, no schools, still in his 20s. And he was to stay there for the rest of his life. Never to leave that village. You can imagine how discouraging that was. Elder Kulakov knew German, so he was hired by a family who had children that they wanted to teach German to. And he said he slept in the room with these 2 or 3 kids, and he had to sleep on the floor by a door. He said the first few months was so discouraging. He said, God, will I ever get out of this village? But Pastor Kulakov was a very talented man. Not only did he know the Bible well and was he committed in his faith, but he knew German, and he was an artist. He drew a lot. And so he was drawing pictures. And a nurse, a number of months later, visited that village and said, you know, you're just kind of wasting your talent here. Why are you here? You should be teaching art in one of our art schools. Would you be willing to teach in one of the communist schools? He thought anything to get out of this village. To have more young people. So finally, he was allowed to get out of that village, and the nurse made arrangements for him. And he was moved to another town where they needed an art teacher, and he began teaching art in a public school. Fortunately, about a number of miles from there, not too far, was a little Adventist church. Now, in that church was a dear, dear woman. And she was a young woman at the time and began to pray. And as she was praying one night, according to her story, Anna, as she was praying, had a dream. And in that dream, the angel spoke to her. And the angel said to her, there's a young pastor that will come to your church. His name is Mikhail Kulakov. He is from Moscow. And eventually, he will be your husband. She didn't know what to make of the dream and had never met Mikhail Kulakov before. And one day he walked into church, introduced himself as an Adventist pastor, and named Mikhail Kulakov. She just blushed and said, is this the man that God told me about my dream? Now, when I met Anna, I said, Anna, let me ask you this. Did you tell Mikhail the first time you met him, hey, you're going to be my husband? She laughed and smiled and turned all red and said, oh, no, Pastor, I'd never do that. The two met, and they developed a courtship relationship eventually, and they were married. Now, as Elder Kulakov tells the story, he says the communist government sent me to life exile to silence my voice. But to that couple, there were 6 children born, 3 girls and 3 boys. The 3 boys all became Adventist pastors, and the 3 girls became Adventist pastors' wives. And Elder Kulakov says to me with kind of a smile and a little chuckle, you'd have to know him to appreciate it. He said, well, Pastor Mark, the communist government sent me to life exile to silence my voice, but God sent me there to produce pastors. And it is so true. When we have faith in God, He takes the most difficult, the most challenging circumstance and turns it around for His glory. As young people, we have a destiny to follow. We have footsteps to walk in, the footsteps of the great Advent pioneers, the footsteps of the biblical characters, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, footsteps of Matthew, Mark, Luke, the footsteps of Paul, the footsteps of these great heroes of faith in the former Soviet Union and communist countries who really died for their faith, many of them sent to prison. We can't let them down now. We cannot turn our backs on what God has called us to do. Trusting Him, He will lead us to a destiny far beyond what we could ever imagine.